Hi, this is Kayla interrupting this special episode of This Is Your Life Path just before we begin to share the news that I am currently crowdfunding for a zine game called Ritual Magic for Bestie. It's on Crowdfunder. It is written and designed by me and illustrated by Molimut. It's a GM-less tarot-based game about casting spells with your friends, using your mutual connections. We're crowdfunding until the end of February 24. So what I need you to do is you can just search Ritual Magic for Besties and that will find it quickly, or go to crowdfunder.com/Ritual Magic and please back and share. Now let's jump into the episode. I'm Kayla Dice, and this is Your Life Path. I'm an out-of-control tabletop role-playing game designer, and on this show I talk to other tabletop creatives about everything that inspires or influences them away from role-playing. Welcome to the show. My guest today joining me is the creator of the currently Kickstarting Me, the Singularity, Michael Duxbary. Hello, Michael. Thank you for coming on the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself more fully to the audience?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Hi, I am Michael Duxbary. I am a freelance writer, designer, and self-publisher of tabletop role-playing games. I work freelance for various established RPG publishers, doing content such as the Warhammer RPGs for Cubicle 7, the Star Trek and Cohorts Cthulhu RPGs for Modiphius, working on the One More Quest game for Horrible Guild. But I also self-publish various indie story games like Lady Beast, Crying Wolf, Field Trip, and Golden Eggs. And as you mentioned, they're currently kickstarting Me, the Singularity.
Would you like to, just while we're up top, I've got some more questions which are going to go in depth on Me, the Singularity as the big sort of focus of the episode, but would you like to just do a quick pitch to the listeners up top about what the game is about?
For sure. So Me, the Singularity is a zine game that's being funded for Zine Quest. It's a haunted house in space game. It's an adaptation of a visual novel by Super Circuit, now being adapted to a tabletop role-playing form, in which the crew of a deep space research station are haunted by an extra-dimensional ghost and have to try and interpret its cryptic warnings, which are the only thing that can save them from a looming catastrophe.
Yeah, I read a preview of the game sent over before this interview. It's really interesting, exciting, and you've also been doing lots of threads on Twitter about different things that have inspired it that I found really interesting to read along to. Like I said, we'll dive more into that first, but first just going through the standard sort of life questions. So I guess the first thing is, we're recording this in person in London, where we both live. Have you always lived in London, or did you grow up elsewhere?
I grew up elsewhere. The first place I really remember living is in Gloucester, which is where I moved when I was 5. And that was where I was until I left school. Gloucester was okay. I remember not being super happy there whilst I was there, but now kind of look back at it with a bit more nostalgia. In the way that I guess is common for people once they reach adulthood and move away from home and then find things to miss about it.
Yeah, it makes sense. Where did you go after Gloucester?
So when I went to university, I went to university at King's College London.
Oh.
So I've basically been in London ever since. The only exception was for a gap year in between. I knew I was going to university in London. I knew London would be very expensive and I would need money. So I worked for a year in order to give myself enough money to be able to survive in London for most of those 3 years. And then, have stayed in London ever since.
That makes sense. So Gloucester and London are very sort of different places, and I similarly moved here for university and have stayed since, and I often do find myself thinking of like an almost two halves of my life. I wondered if for you that difference between places and stuff has informed any of your work, or whether your childhood experiences in Gloucester did. I guess I'm thinking of Crying Wolf slightly, and that's linked to childhood. Does it link to place to you, or is that maybe a harder influence to trace?
It's interesting. I'm not sure the place of Gloucester is something that is something I've reconstructed in some of the games that I've done, so much as the experiences I remember from there. The most obvious one is that I got really into Warhammer when I was a kid, and that's now a big part of the job that I do is doing the Warhammer RPGs. my childhood wasn't always a happy one in the way that I guess is true for a lot, or certainly a lot of people. And I think that that feeling in Crying Wolf, which, just to give some context, is a game inspired by the Aesop fable of the boy that cried wolf, of children being haunted by a monster that is stalking them, and of course, as in the fable, attempts to warn adults of the monsters that are out there, are not listened to or are not heeded. I guess that speaks to somewhat feelings of not quite fitting in. When I was a kid, I didn't have a lot of friends. That's partially informed, I think, by the fact that I was moved ahead at school a couple of years, and obviously that's a time in your life where a difference of 2 years between you and your peers can be very, very significant and feel very significant.
Being in some way singled out in some way from the rest of your immediate peers can feel very alienating, I imagine.
Yeah, I think so. And, there's a bit in the character creation for Crying Wolf where you determine things about your character in this sing-song chorus, where one of the characters gets to point to another member of the group and say, I think you're stupid, or I think you're brave, or I think you're clever, and then the rest of the children of the village, if they agree, can kind of like chorus in on that in a kind of sing-song voice, like, you're stupid, or whatever. And I think that, that's obvious, that kind of like childish name-calling, I think is immersing people in the fact that you're going to be playing younger characters in Crying Wolf. But I also think, most people have probably experienced something like that, so it's also a way of helping to get yourself into the headspace of your character, or something that works for me anyway.
The way, like, childishness often really is about, like, marking things. It's like, this is the thing about you.
Yes.
Like, you're stupid, or you're taller than everyone, or you're younger than everyone, or you're older than everyone. Like,
yeah.
And those are the things that are important for your character, and often it's because it's the only thing that is maybe distinguishing you from a bunch of other people, because you don't actually have much way of having figured out your identity yet.
Exactly. Trying to find ways to distinguish yourself when you don't have the life experience necessary to actually do that. And what I think is really interesting is, this process in character creation of being told that your character is stupid, or told that your character is brave or clever, doesn't mean they actually are. It just means that that's how the character's perceived, and they might be perceived that way because it's true, but it's also, I think, speaking to how the perception of your peers is something that can be formed very, very quickly for very arbitrary reasons, and still be very difficult to shake regardless of the amount of truth to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I was maybe 21, I think it was, actually. I remember saying to someone that I considered myself shy, and they told me I was basically full of shit.
Yeah.
They're like, this is completely ridiculous. You've never struck me as shy in the entire time I've known you. And this was a friend who had known me maybe since I'd started uni. And I realised it's the fact of, I got told I was shy as a kid. And realistically, what shy as a kid meant was awkward, like, rather than shy actually specifically. And then I just carried through that, and still... less so now, a bit further on, but it's one of those things where I notice myself struggling to shake this self-image that came from childhood.
I have the same in that I felt that I was very introverted when I was in school, and I think that there is probably some truth to that. It's partially informed by feeling as though I was somewhat isolated or whatever, in a way a lot of kids do. At the same time, I look back on some of the things that I was felt to believe about myself in that time, and I don't think that is me, and I'm not sure that ever was.
Yeah.
But, also people go to university and they change and they discover things that are new about themselves, so...
Yeah. Do you have a memory of what you wanted to be when you were younger?
Yes. I knew from quite young that what I wanted to be was a teacher. In my final couple of years at school, I did quite a lot of volunteering with a local special educational needs school, which I enjoyed a lot and found very rewarding. I got to do it instead of PE, so that was a bonus. And I thought that after I went to university, I would do teacher training, and then that would be kind of like the trajectory of my life. I actually, after I left university, did spend a year working as a teaching assistant. Similar kind of story that I didn't feel financially confident that I'd be able to go straight from university into doing another degree and doing another course, and still being a year behind because I moved ahead 2 years and only taken the one gap year. But what I discovered after working that year as a teaching assistant is that it wasn't for me. I didn't love the person that I was when I was working as a teaching assistant. I felt like I spent quite a lot of my days shouting at people, shouting at children, and I didn't like that very much. I know there are some teachers who just have that kind of aura of respect, I guess, that they're able to kind of be respected by pupils or children, and who then follow their lead because they recognise that it's something that they're doing for their own benefit. I never mastered that. I never mastered that skill, and I realised it wasn't something that I wanted to keep doing.
Yeah, from my times teaching, I remember definitely sometimes feeling like, because of just the way certain school environments were set up, I was like, I feel this making me worse at what I'm doing. And I think a big reason I quit in the end was looking at it and going like, I don't know how possible it is for me personally to be a good teacher in a bad system.
Yeah, it's rough, and it feels like it gets rougher all the time for people who are trying to make it work. And as in many industries, where the people who work in it are really passionate about what they do, that's very easy to exploit, and to result in really quite unacceptable and horrible working situations that, results in burnout and people dropping out of the profession.
This might be a quite heavy question, so feel free to bounce it away, but what did it feel like sort of after that year to look at it and go, this is something I wanted for a long time, and now I have to look at it and say, I don't want this?
It was very disorienting because, as you say, it was very much what I'd been kind of like focused on. It was the plan of what I was then going to do for the rest of my life, and I found myself really not sure about what I was going to do next. I was lucky in that I was able to have a bit of a downtime. That makes it sound like not working. I couldn't afford to do that. The end of the end of the year in which I worked as a TA was the summer of 2012. So I was able to work the 2012 Olympics. Which was a really good stopgap moment of, obviously this isn't something I can continue to do, but there wasn't the pressure on me immediately to find, okay, well that plan for your life has fallen through, now you have to immediately find a new plan for the rest of your life. I was able to have that transitionary period of do this thing and then work out what the new plan is later. That was a lot of fun, actually, working in the Olympics. I got, obviously a lot of access to all the Olympic sites because that was required in order for me to do my job. A lot of my friends did the same. So
was it stewarding people around?
It was distributing radios, basically. I was working for a German company that were, giving all the radios for security and other staff on the Olympic sites. And I was dishing out radios or collecting them back in or helping to troubleshoot faults with them. Often there wasn't that much going on, and it was really interesting working for a German company, which had a very different ethos to what I've experienced working for British companies, where for British companies, there is a real sense that you have to look busy all the time.
Yes.
You have to always make sure that even if nothing's going on, that you're pretending that there is. Whilst the attitude of the German employers I had for the Olympics was, we expect you to do a job, we expect you to do what we hired you to do, and so long as you've done that, we don't really care what you do the rest of the time. It doesn't actually matter to us. Which was really refreshing. It was a really nice team to work for. To know that I felt like I was achieving what it was that they wanted without being under the pressure of all the bullshit.
Keeping up appearances.
Exactly, yeah.
That makes sense. Before I actually move on, what was it you studied at university?
So I studied history and war studies. There aren't many universities in the UK that do war studies courses. and King's College London was one, and I was attracted to King's College London for the prospect of doing that, because military history was something that I'd been interested in as a kid and informed a lot of my hobbies. And over the course of doing that degree, I got to pick up quite a few modules in like the classics and ancient history side of things as well, which was also really interesting for someone like me who had an interest in
I know that's a very big
history.
department at King's, I think.
Right? Yeah. There's a lot going on there. I mean, I never could have done a classics degree, say, because the language side of things was always a huge barrier for me. But being able to study the ancient history, being able to do courses in, Macedonian Alexander of Macedon and related stuff, the changing of warfare in the ancient world and all that kind of things, I found that really interesting. So yeah.
Do you think the war studies element has, or I guess just like that knowledge base has informed what you've done with Cubicle 7 on Warhammer Fantasy?
For sure, yeah. I think Warhammer Fantasy in particular has close inspiration from real world cultures, certainly in its genesis. And I try to use that experience in the work that I'm doing. I have, picked up other work that also, it is within that sphere. Cohor's Cthulhu, which is a upcoming release from Modiphius, is Roman legions versus Cthulhu and all the people caught between those two terrible powers, which I find a lot of fun to do. I've got an adventure coming for that in the near future. So yeah, I try to take advantage of that wherever I can. Although I always try to set expectations in the... I know there are a lot of students of history who will, for example, get very annoyed about the way in which historical events will be represented in film or television or media, and bemoan that. I'm very much a game first centered person, so I always feel like I need to set expectations of, I have a background in this, but don't expect me. If what you want is like an archaeologist who really knows this stuff inside out and is going to be bringing that verisimilitude to every part of what is produced, that's probably going to be a second priority for me to making something that's fun to play.
You've got the knowledge base, but you approach it from the game side first, because that's what you've been hired to do.
Yeah, and
you've
that's
not been
my
hired
passion.
As a historical consultant.
Exactly. Yeah. I wouldn't be qualified to give the deep dive in that.
But a knowledge base that does inform you. Going back to the teaching assisting side, actually, I wondered, do you feel that has maybe ever informed, I guess, the way you present information, in terms of, conveying information to a reader? I wonder, because it's something I, with a teaching background, sometimes think about in terms of how I present information to a reader versus how I'd present lesson topics to a classroom.
Absolutely. I think that trying to find a way to teach a subject to people who aren't familiar with it, that's very relevant to what I do as a game designer and the rules text that I'm writing to teach. I think it's just such an underrated quality in game masters or facilitators in tabletop RPGs. There's so much content out there about how to be a good game master, which will be covering things like how to roleplay NPCs or how to balance a combat encounter or something. And I think how to teach a game, which isn't necessarily a part of a GM's job. There's no reason it has to be the GM's job to teach everyone how to play the game, but that is the cultural expectation. It's a really hard thing to do, and I think games which have advice on how to do that in their GM material is really, really valuable, and that's something that I try to bring in as well into what I write.
It's interesting, and as well, I think, because of advice around how to teach also, I think, sometimes really benefits from an understanding of how people learn, which
Yes.
is obviously not a thing that people know about unless you look into, but definitely... I often think about how I'm conveying an information to a reader. I tend to think about how would I understand this, and what is the limitations of what I take. And to be fair, that was always how I approached a classroom.
Sure.
It's not how every teacher approaches a classroom, of course, but it's one. But I like to hear that informs process, because I found all of your games I read through very easy to understand, even though many of them often involved mechanical choices or different system stuff that I'd not encountered before.
Sure.
Or were, one-shot games which are inherently a bespoke experience, but I didn't feel adrift in your writing, is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm glad.
So after the Olympics, what did you move on to next?
So after the Olympics, then was the Paralympics. But after the Paralympics, I worked in the civil service as a freelancer and then a contractor rather than a civil servant. First for the Ministry of Justice and then for the Environment Agency. I did that for 8 years until I went into full-time game design, which was about 3 years ago now. So yeah, about 8 years that I was working for the civil service.
Do you think that's something that has informed your work much, or either informed it, or was it just in terms of facilitating it, in terms of having time and money and space via job?
Yes to both. In terms of where it's informed my writing, one of the games I wrote, Golden Eggs, which is a sequel to Crying Wolf, a sequel in the Dark Aesop series. This one inspired by the goose that laid the golden egg, and how employers exploit the people who are most productive in order to maximise. Look, I can be very cynical about the experience of working an office job like that in the civil service. Although I should probably be careful with what I say, because I always kind of assume eventually this game business life is going to bankrupt me, and I'm probably going to end up back there. What I will say is that I was very fortunate that I was eventually able to segue into doing 4-day working weeks whilst I was contracting for the civil service. And that 1 day a week off was very, very helpful for accommodating a shift into full-time game design work, because you can't flip a switch and suddenly be doing full-time tabletop role-playing work. It just doesn't work that way. You need to have the transition from starting up, picking up stuff here and there, and then generally building momentum. And I was able to build momentum because of the opportunities that was afforded there.
That makes sense.
So I was very lucky, yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that you were interested in, did you say, Warhammer when you were younger? Was that your introduction to RPGs through the sort of Games Workshop side of things?
Yes. Or? Yeah. I think started off. I mean, we'll go all the way back to my introduction to fantasy gaming. It was the Warcraft strategy games, the video games. This was before the MMO World of Warcraft. This was the original strategy games. And from there, that kind of like cultivated an interest in Warhammer. In the year, I want to say 2000, there was a Warhammer game called Inquisitor, which was a narrative skirmish game, air quotes, which was very much... Inquisitor was such a weird game. It was a hybrid of skirmish level miniatures war game with big 54mm miniatures with role-playing elements. So for someone who never role-played before but was in the Games Workshop miniatures wargaming hobby, Inquisitor was my gateway drug. Especially because not that long after Inquisitor, the tabletop RPG Dark Heresy was introduced, which was, I think, the first Warhammer 40k tabletop RPG, and was also themed around the Inquisition. So I was able to go directly from Warhammer to Inquisitor to Dark Heresy into other Warhammer RPGs, and then finally growing up and, exploring the wider hobby of tabletop RPGs. So yeah, I think like a lot of Brits, the original route into tabletop gaming was through Warhammer. It's funny, because as I say, I started with Warcraft. So I think there is an alternate universe version of myself, which really got into video games and wasn't really involved in this kind of stuff at all, and made my career there instead. But my mum rationed my computer access and didn't ration my access to miniatures and paints. Actually, that's not true. There was the cost of buying the miniatures, but I could then use the miniatures as much as I wanted. So then the rest is history. Then I really got into
sliding doors moments are interesting to notice. And so, do you So obviously you work in freelance stuff, which has involved working with Warhammer and things that seem designed for like much bigger scope campaign play versus your independent work, which is often very focused on one shots. I think I did have a specific question here I asked. It's sort of just prompted this. Yeah, I was wondering both how you find the differences between those two sides. Is it something you separate out in your mind very cleanly? Are you always more focused on does the work feel the same when it's your work versus for someone else? And also, I guess, what as an independent compels you about the structure of the one-shot game?
For sure. The boring answer for why a lot of my self-published content is one-shot oriented is it's just a lot easier to playtest one-shot games than it is to playtest a whole campaign. I wouldn't say I prefer one-shot play to campaign play, or the other way around. I play a lot of one-shots. I play a lot of campaign games. I think it's one of the respects in which I'm very lucky as a designer is I play and I run a lot of tabletop role-playing games, maybe 100 a year for the last 10 years, covering 150 systems or so. So I am lucky that I get to do a mix of the indie story game stuff, which focuses on one-shot play, and the campaign stuff. I would love to self-publish a longer form game, and I feel like that's the direction that my game design is going, because I love working on other people's games in the freelance sense, getting the experience of what is expected for supporting a game line. But I think if you are doing one of those bigger games, a campaign game, there is the expectation that that's something that is going to be continue to receive support in its most traditional sense. You can't release a fancy D20 game if you're not then going to release some adventures, right? And that's very demanding resource-wise, but as my one-shot story games are a bit more popular, I hope, and find an audience, I hope, I would love to then start exploring, okay, what does it look like for me to design a game that's designed for more long-form play? Because I think you can get a lot of really satisfying role-play out of that. Really fun crunch to the mechanics when you start investing in the idea of system mastery and variance in gameplay experience. But there is something about the hyper specificity of the one-shot story game that really appeals to me as well.
I think something that I often find really interesting about a one-shot story game, and I think is really the case in your games as well, is the ability to have, for a designer to have designed an ending experience, which I think often is not the responsibility of the designer when it comes to campaign games. That feels more the responsibility of the GM in my limited experience there.
I gotta say, I do wish that designers gave more consideration for the end game experience. I understand why they don't. It's because a lot of games fold before they reach the end game, right? So it's not least of all the playtests conducted internally within the studio. It's much much as it's much easier to playtest a one shot, it's much easier to playtest a short campaign than a long one. But it's so routine for tabletop RPGs designed for longer form play to just become dysfunctional by the time you reach the end game. And games that do give consideration to that end game, I respect a great deal. I'm thinking of Monster Hearts' growing up moves as a great example for consideration of what endgame play looks like. Apocalypse World had introduced the idea of you unlocking advanced versions of the basic moves. I think it was Monster Hearts that innovated the idea of these moves are going to conclude your character's thematic arc. You are growing up. And these moves are going to give consideration to the move snowball. It's such a common feature of Powered by the Apocalypse play that a move flows into a move, flows into a move, flows into a move, flows into a move, and that's by design. But then it's like, but when does it stop? Like, when can I get off the ride and go home? And the growing up moves from Monster Hearts are exactly designed that way, to bring a conclusive ending to the story.
Yeah.
Band of Blades is another example I played recently that has a wonderful end game. That's kind of like a military fantasy Forged in the Dark game in which there is a pre-written campaign of your army of legionnaires making it from its starting location to its ending location. So the final siege is then the conclusive, set piece of the campaign. And I really
a campaign in multiple sense of the word.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Band of Blades is a brilliant game. It's one of the best games I've played recently. I love that game.
Going back to Monster Hearts, I think like the Monster Hearts grown-up moves are interesting because the ending there and the sense of an ending is really, I think, about asking questions of like, what is it to be the player character in this world? And what is it that changes about you that to a certain extent means you're no longer suitable to be the protagonist of this sort of story and it's time to take your exit?
Absolutely. Like, there's... I think there's a perception that stopping playing a character, especially before the end of a campaign, constitutes a failure state. Like, it's something that you do when your character is dead, or something that you do when your character isn't gelling with the group. I think there's something really powerful to say, I'm retiring this character because this character is no longer the hero of the story. This character has concluded their character arc.
Yeah.
Or this character still belongs in this world, but they belong in this world as an NPC rather than a player character. Certainly, I find that much more satisfying than we got to the end game, we got to high-level play, and the game is now basically broken, and there's nothing left in the universe to challenge us. I don't find that satisfying at all.
Yeah, that gets to a point where you're just sort of not almost stuck by never being able to get stuck.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So, going specifically to me, the Singularity. The game is an adaptation of the visual novel of the same name by Super Circuit. I was wondering, who first approached who about the adaptation?
So I approached Super Circuit about doing the adaptation through the very cheeky method of telling her about it after I'd already started working on it. I know Super Circuit very well. We've been friends for a long time. I've often been able to see and enjoy her work, and I was able to. I realised that what she was doing was incredible, and it was an obvious opportunity for tabletop adaptation for us to be working together on stuff. So being able to turn around to her one day and say, "Oh, I'm working on a tabletop adaptation of a really cool visual novel that I played recently," and then she was like, "Oh, what's the visual novel?" And saying Me the Singularity, which she went wild at, was a lot of fun. It felt like there was obvious opportunity for us to be working together on taking the original story that she'd written and expanding that into a form that could be enjoyed in multiple different ways to encourage replay value. And then it was this January, very late notice, that I decided I was going to run a Kickstarter, my first Kickstarter for Zine Month, inspired by a talk on crowdfunding that was given by Matt Sanders of Roma and Deckard on the UK Tabletop Industry Network Discord, which I'm also the organiser of. And that motivated me to do a Kickstarter and to reach out to Super Circuit and to say, I know I've been working on this game for a while, I'd love to do it as a Kickstarter, is that okay? And then to my delight, not only was that okay, but she was enthusiastic to come on board and be part of doing layout and additional illustration work for the game and writing lore and all that good stuff.
That's really great.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think we'll talk a bit more about that collaboration, but I think it's something that does really make the game sing and feels really exciting about the project. I guess a question related to this is, what elements of the visual novel did you think were sort of most important to translate? The game doesn't feature the characters specifically from the visual novel, and the nature of the catastrophe that affects the characters can be different, but it places the players instead in a similar situation. And I guess I was wondering, what were the sort of core elements you wanted to focus on?
So there's Me the Singularity, the visual novel, has this kind of structure of the characters going about living their relatively mundane lives, albeit within a science fiction setting, with these periodic intrusions of a haunting entity and not understanding what's going on. that was the main structure that I felt was important to translate into the tabletop RPG. The fact that the presence of the ghost is not something that you're seeking out. You're not playing ghost hunters or similar. It's something that kind of leaks in and then becomes a mystery for the players to unravel to understand why this is happening and why this is so important. This is a big spoiler for the visual novel, but the ghost entity is an alternate reality version of one of the crew members of the space station. And that was another very important thing for me to translate. The sense that whoever is playing the ghost would be playing a version of one of the other people around the table, and the fun of discovering who that was during play. It's funny talking to Super Circuit about like what the themes of the game are, because I think she approaches it. I don't know. It would be worth asking her about that, but I think she often approaches it from the perspective of she loved the idea of doing a ghost story. She was working on something that had a lot of science fiction elements, and so looked for an excuse to marry them together. I think the idea of this of the character being haunted by themselves, a version of themselves that made different choices, a version of themselves that has experienced great tragedy, but is then working to help themselves avoid repeating that mistake. I don't know. I think those are really powerful personal themes, and you know, it's the title of the game. That sense of being haunted by yourself.
I think it's then really interesting as well the way the ghost's interactions with other players are limited in terms of sort of, you know, taking away almost certain senses as wavelengths of communication, and I think that can sort of mimic something of feeling the, I suppose, aftermath of traumatic experiences and how those are carried.
Yeah, like alienation from yourself. You know, feeling at a remove from what has happened to you. I think that's something I relate to from some of my own traumatic experiences. And I think that's fertile ground for consenting role players to cover within a story. To give a bit more context about what that means in practice in the game, the Singularity, you have most of the players playing the crew at the space station and one of the players playing the ghost. And the ghost can't speak for a lot of the game. The ghost is very limited in the way in which they're able to interact with the other player characters. There are specific moments where they're able to intercede with what we call haunting scenes and communicate with the other players. But those communications aren't by talking to them. Those communications are with gestures, like in charades, or their pictures, like in Pictionary, or word fragments, like in Hangman. And over the course of the game, as the crew become more empathetic and more understanding about what's going on, they unlock new ways for the ghost to communicate, so that the ghost can communicate the essential information about the looming catastrophe, which the crew have to solve in order to survive the end of the game. If you've played something like Mysterium, especially the variant Mysterium rule where the ghost is only allowed to communicate by knocking on the table rather than speaking out loud, it's similar to that, except I can't afford to print, 200 Mysterium cards. So we used more accessible ways for limited forms of communication, such as charades and Pictionary and other games that people are familiar with that model that quite well.
I find it really interesting, grabbing these very sort of straightforward and accessible things. Obviously it's a cultural context dependent. I do think about the fact, I feel if I attempted to explain a roll under system to my parents, I think they'd get it eventually. I don't mean to imply they're, not capable of grasping it, but it would be new and unfamiliar to them. If I was like, it's charades, but it's also about plot, they'd be like, oh, okay, right, yeah, that makes sense. I know charades.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't need to explain charades to me, Kayla.
It's already a tough ask when you ask a non-role player to roleplay, or someone who's only ever roleplayed D&D to play a story game. they're already going to be in an unfamiliar space. Anything you can do to try and make that a little bit easier. I mean, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about teaching an RPG. Anything that makes that onboarding process smoother, I think, is smart, especially for something that you want to get people to play immediately and then be over and done with in a couple of hours.
Yeah. You've described the game as a haunted house in space RPG. That's been a big line in the marketing, which is a really great line and also is really immediately evocative.
Thank you.
But what I was wondering is, what do you think of as the hallmarks of a haunted house story? I suppose in this sense, as opposed to just a broader ghost story in other senses. And how was it that you wanted to... And yeah, were these hallmarks you wanted to consciously evoke in the tabletop game?
It's trite, but I guess the distinctive feature of a haunted house story is the house, right? It's the sense of place. It's anchoring the action to a physical location. The phrase "haunted house in space" I stole from the elevator pitch for the movie Event Horizon, which is one of the inspirations for the original visual novel. And which, similar to Alien, takes the idea of characters being stranded in a location like a haunted house that is difficult to escape from whilst being stalked by a dangerous and ephemeral entity. And it's hard to get much more stranded than outer space, right? You're on a space station, you can't get away from that. In terms of trying to put the themes of that into the story, on one hand, there's the escalating tension of feeling trapped. The players know, but the crew don't. The player characters don't necessarily know that there is some kind of terrible catastrophe looming. And space is awful. Like, terrible things happen in space. So the idea of being trapped in this environment that's not easy to get away from, where innumerable things can go wrong, and the threat to life and limb and the prospect of a horrible demise is looming overhead, I think is good for the sense of pacing and tension. But also, most haunted house stories are someone's home, someone lives there. And I think there's something especially frightening and especially personal about the sense of your home being something that's under threat, that you're not even safe within your own personal space. And a lot of Me, the Singularity has this kind of like slice of life mundane element to it. And there's something very fun about establishing a sense of comfort and sanctuary with a physical location, and then start joking around with that. I'm thinking of movies like Paranormal Activity, which set the expectation that the hauntings only happen at night, and you alternate between day and night, and then later in the movie, the hauntings start interjecting into the daytime just when you thought you were safe. Or video games like Silent Hill 4, The Room, where the titular room is kind of like the safe house and save room, and eventually that also comes under attack by the end of the game, just at the point you're starting to get comfortable and feel safe there. Anything that you can use, anything that you can encourage the players to lead on and then turn against them. It's a mean trick. I like it.
Essentially giving them a crutch, then at some point in the game kicking that out from under them.
Exactly, yes. Classic horror style.
The element there you said about sort of the fact of like a haunted house is a house and a house is often a home reminded me of my next question, which was that the day-night cycle of play in the games put me in the mind of slice of life stories. And I'm aware, I guess it also works for the case of haunting stories where hauntings occur in similar ways, but yeah, I was wondering, like, what was your thoughts with that cycle of play? Was it that kind of influence, or was there some other thing? There's also a day-night cycle in your game, Lady Beast, but it does feel the thematic weight in Me, the Singularity is placed differently, even though it's a similar cycle.
It is. They do both have that theme, but approach it in different ways. In both cases, the seeds of including that in the mechanics are in the source material. Lady Beast, which is a romantic fantasy game inspired by 80s fantasy movies, especially the movie Ladyhawke, in about two lovers, one of whom turns into an animal at day, one of whom turns into an animal at night, and they're trying to break the curse that keeps them apart. Obviously, the day-night cycle to that had very significant narrative importance, and you see that in how it paces the story as well. That the story of Ladyhawke is set over 3 days and 3 nights leading up to an eclipse, and that's exactly the structure that Lady Beast uses. Similarly, Me the Singularity takes the day-night cycle from the original visual novel and translates that into the game. That's part of it. But I think you're right that part of that is setting a routine, making it feel as though it is normal people living a normal life, so that the extra dimensional intrusion feels all the more startling and horrifying. We originally playtested a version of Me the Singularity in which the moments of the haunting were very structured. There would be a day scene, then there would be a haunting, there would be a night scene, then there would be a haunting. The hauntings would always happen after the players were finished doing their day-night scenes. And after the first playtest we had, our ghost player, actually my wife, Emily, was playing the ghost in that first playtest, said, the fact that I can't talk and the fact that I'm not involved in these scenes is atmospheric and thematic and isolating and creepifying and boring. I would like to be more involved in the game, please. And from there, we adjusted the shift to be the ghost gets to choose the moment in which they interject into that. I like that rule a lot better. First of all, because I think it gives a lot more agency to the ghost character. It means they are paying much closer attention to what's going on. Because it can often be really useful to be able to choose their moments to interject as another way of giving a clue. But also because I think on a thematic level, there's less order to it. There's order to the cycle of day and night, and the hauntings are an intrusion into that. It's similar to what we're saying about the home. The day-night cycle sets a routine, it sets an expectation, and then the interjections of occult phenomena are then kind of like bucking that trend, defying expectation.
And that plays out very differently if you have like this set aside instance where it's like this is where the supernatural happens versus this can happen at any time.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I do think it's a big part of what seemed interesting to me just about the structure of playing the game.
I mean, I often do generally have quite a lot of predefined structures in my games in terms of this happens, then this happens, then like in phases of play is something that interests me, and a fixed number of phases of play to pace the game. And I've talked a lot about how I use that fixed pacing in order to try and evoke the themes of particular genres or particular stories that I want to tell. It is also just how I prefer to play games. Making something fit within one shot, making a role-playing game fit within a one-shot, I think is a real challenge. It's something that I find difficult as a GM. And having a fixed, limited number of scenes that everyone knows up front is going to be featured in the game keeps everyone honest. It means everyone knows, well, we only have a few hours to play, so we can't let this scene roll forever because we have to have these other scenes coming up as well, which I think helps. I also think that it makes the game more flexible for numbers of players. I've played a lot of games where the rule is, everyone frames a scene or everyone frames 2 scenes or something, which means if you're playing with 6 people, you're going to play for 3 times longer than if you're playing with 2, which isn't great. Yeah. It accommodates the practicalities of play as well as the more high-minded design philosophy.
That makes sense, yeah. And I can definitely think of, say, one-shot games I've played where ultimately it's like, well, these ended on a cliffhanger because we did not pace this well enough, which, obviously is a thing that players can redress, but also, a structured sort of gameplay can redress that as well. So the next set questions I had were more like general process ones. But it's a case where like you may bring it back to any game, and I understand that probably your priority would be how can I bring it back to Me the Singularity. So
sure.
Just going in that. So obviously we talked a bit about like Aesop's fables in relation to some of your games, and talked about how inspiration from the visual novel of Me, the Singularity. I guess I was wondering, in general, what reading do you find informs your writing?
For sure. I don't read as much as I should, or as much as I'd like to. A lot of what I do read is short form non-fiction stuff online, news blogs, that kind of thing, which does, inform my writing. Certainly the social conscience and my political affiliation and how I try to capture that in what I'm writing. Which is sometimes difficult to do when working on freelance material for licensed property, who absolutely hate to hear me say this kind of things in an interview. But the other stuff that I read that maybe isn't in the spirit of the podcast, which I know is about exploring things that are influential other than games. I do read a lot of other people's games, and as I say, I play a lot of other people's games, which I often find myself stealing from. I mean, I just made jibes about working on adaptational property. I love working on adaptational games. I don't know if it has the same prestige, maybe, of working on original content, original game lines, but the idea of iterating on other people's work is something I find really enjoyable, and when I'm designing for myself, I iterate on other people's design, I iterate on other people's mechanics, rarely choosing to import other people's game systems, although Lady Beast is a Forge in the Dark game, but very often taking bits and pieces here and there from the things that I'm doing. This was a question about reading. That wasn't a reading answer.
No, I get what you're saying, and I was thinking recently, I should start a thread of the reading I do this month. And when I've talked to other people before, and they're like, well, what have you read this year? And I will often just bundle in any prose books I read, as well as any graphic novels, and also any RPGs. I'm like, these are the books I read this year. They're all books. What? And some people get really annoyed at me when I do that, but I'm like, well, no, these are all books that I read. What I don't count is RPGs that I read in a more referencey way with the specific intention of running. But if I read something just to read it, I'm like, it's a book, I read it.
Yeah, like, you definitely can get a lot of inspiration. Like, I generally try hard to make sure that I'm buying stuff that I'm actually going to use at the table. But even if you're just buying something that you're reading for inspiration that then feeds into your thoughts about design or thoughts about something that you run, then you got value out of that book, nothing to complain about.
I definitely I remember when I was a stand-up comedian, I definitely always said that I felt much better as a stand-up comedian when I was watching more stand-up. At the very least, watching more stand-up in a similar style to the one I wanted to work in. So
for sure,
it's not necessarily the focus of this podcast, but I do think it's a thing that's at least important to me.
Yeah.
But I guess on the note of writing, and also I think it does tie into what you were mentioning about working on adaptive properties, I was wondering how consciously you think about your narrative voice in writing. I was thinking how the voice of Crying Wolf really feels tuned to the experiences of the children, for instance, but also, yeah, I imagine with some of the publishers that I've worked with, do they have sort of requested like house styles of voice almost?
Oh, for sure. Style guide is life. Yeah, it's... Yes, I often have to be... It's most obvious and most boring when it's adaptational media, when there's certain content they do or don't want you to touch, and content they want written in a certain way. For good reason. Narrative voice is important in making sure that something feels as though you're evoking the theme and the style of that particular world, and I try to put that into my original material as well. It's certainly very important when I'm GMing, the voice you use as a GM, I think, is really important, not just to indicate what is and isn't important, because your voice as the GM is the only guide that players have to the world in which they're inhabiting, but also in terms of setting tone, in terms of making characters feel like they're immersed in what makes this world unique. So I do try to capture that in my writing. I do try to make the effort to use language and direct my focus proportionate to the audience that I'm writing for or how I want the game to be played. Field Trip is a game which is focused on a younger audience or the younger heart. It's a game I wrote for the Buddy System Jam by Jessica Markram, and it's a game about a group of rascally school children foiling a museum heist. So a very kind of like Home Alone, Night at the Museum sort of vibe. I joke about it being my repentance for the horrible things I did to children in Crying Wolf. And I did have in mind that, if I want this to be something that's played by younger children, the language that you're choosing should reflect that. And again, that goes back to talking about teaching and trying to use those experiences as the basis, as the baseline for what I was writing about. And I was very lucky that a friend of mine who is a teacher was able to playtest their game with some of the kids for the gaming club that they've run. So that was really, really inspiring and really rewarding.
That makes sense. And I don't know, this is perhaps personal preference, but I always feel much more interested in a book when I'm reading through it. And I get the sense that the writer thought about how the writing would read, if that makes sense. It sounds a basic thing, but I think sometimes I read something and I'm going, the focus here was always, here's the information, here's how I'm conveying it.
Yeah. I think often it can be really fun to see when someone hasn't made the effort to kind of keep their authorial voice out of it. Because I think the idea of keeping rules texts sanitized and focusing like entirely on clarity of information communication of the rules rather than infusing tone and mood into the piece is something that I know a lot of people feel that they prefer in their rules text. It's not what I want. I love when you can feel the voice of the author, when you can imagine the author talking to you in what you're reading. Great example that I read recently was Kieran Gillen's Die, the RPG, although also the graphic novel. It really does feel like this game is being read to you by Kieran Gillen, and it's a joy to read that material. And obviously that's not to say that he's a great professional writer, and I'm sure a lot of thought goes into information communication and specific choice of language as well. But I appreciate when the effort is made to infuse something with a bit of life, a bit of personality. Because reading rules is boring, right?
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to... I studied literature, so I think there is something to a state of being fun to read or not fun to read.
Yes. A very underrated consideration.
Yeah, I know it makes sense how it doesn't necessarily always occur to people. Sorry, because I jump around questions, I then get lost in where I am. This is a bit of an open one, but I think it's sort of a question I leave partly so people can bring up any things that just might not occur to me, and it was wondering if you've ever noticed subtler influences from other mediums, whether that's film or television or just other areas where you have noticed, I definitely draw from this loads.
So, film and television, absolutely. I'm a big film fan. That is very definitely how I interact with role-playing game fiction. I imagine my games as being structured by scenes. When I am playing a player character, I do not imagine myself as that player character. I imagine them as a character in something that I'm watching. When I describe my character's actions, I describe what they are doing, not what I am doing. And that is my preference, and that is reflected in how I write as well. I when I'm writing GM advice, I will often say that, you can often break things down into scenes, and obviously scene is terminology from, theatre, but, film and television as well. I think there's been something of a backlash against that recently. I've definitely read a few design pieces arguing that it's derivative and reductive to translate the language of role-playing games down to terminology that has been inherited from other media, which I think is interesting conceptually. But it is still how I think about it.
It's an interesting thing, though, also. I feel like maybe it does undersell the fact that language isn't necessarily borrowed from cinema originally. It's cinema borrowed it from theatre.
Sure, which has a that live performance aspect.
And then I
really
think
important.
I think of theatre and role-playing games as very similar. It's an interesting thing where I do use terms like scene and stuff a lot in things. But actually, in spite of this not being my background at all, I'm often thinking about that in a theatrical way.
Yeah.
I said sometimes if I name a GM figure the narrator, I'm never figuring that as like the narrator of a book. I'm figuring that as the narrator in a school play, meaning the only kid who knew how to read.
Yes, absolutely. Theatre also isn't my background, so I guess that's why I go to film and television more naturally. But you're right. Like live performance and sort of improvisational theatre has huge overlap with what role playing games are about and what the core activities are. In terms of other influences, when I'm GMing, I prefer to have a soundtrack to my games whenever I can. I find music very useful when I'm writing. Usually if I'm doing an adaptational thing, I will use the music of the thing that I'm writing. It's a pretty obvious association there. Although, when I'm writing for Warhammer, that's the time to get out all the stuff I was listening to when I was a loser 14-year-old. That's the time to break out the Evanescence and the Linkin Park and the Matrix soundtracks.
That makes sense to me.
But then I truly believe that, loser 14-year-olds are an utterly essential audience for any Warhammer product. And that's not me being ironic. I truly believe that. So
loser 14-year-olds are people still in touch with their loser 14-year-olds.
Yes, exactly. That's what I aspire to be. Embarrassingly.
Do you then build playlists for more original works ever, or do you just find something that otherwise feels like a mood match for the writing process?
Yes, more the latter, I'd say, than the former. The alternative is if I'm in a situation where I'm struggling to get work done for whatever reason, that might be the time that I break out something that is just very percussive or loud in order to just encourage me to just keep writing. I know, the lo-fi beats for writing, they don't work on me. I need to feel like I'm being chased by an angry man when I write, which probably is revealing of something. But that can often be something that's really useful when I'm writing and something that I try and use again when I'm gaming in big explosive action sequences. I think music's important as well.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think I'm often very the same, but yeah, it's really interesting to hear about different people's individual approaches with music as a crossover. How does visual art inform your writing in the development process? So I know you put together the visual look for Lady Beast yourself. Crying Wolf has really sort of thematic illustrations and layout by Melissa Trender and Paul Richardson. And we've already talked about how Super Circuit will be doing a lot of the graphic design work for Me, the Singularity, making use from assets from the visual novel. Do you see the visuals and design and graphic design, in a sense, as very separate stages to the writing, or are they interwoven processes for you, or is it a thing that varies on the project?
It is not as much of an influence on my writing as it should be. Would be the thing that I would say. I don't really think visually. It's something I've discovered about myself in the past 3 years of doing this. I really connect with role-playing games because I learn really well and immerse myself really well in things that are being told to me. And the things I say, the things I hear, the things I can interact with in a more tactile way, they feel more significantly influential to me than the visual dimension. Which is bad. What I just did was admit to being bad at my job because product design, graphic design, visual design, it's hugely important in the field of tabletop game design. And I write, but there's nothing special about writing. There's plenty of writers in the tabletop space. We're dime a dozen. The people who can create something beautiful and innovative and accessible and interweave that with the text and with the story and with the rules, that's an incredible skill. So I'm extremely grateful to have had the opportunity to work with Mel and with Paul on Crying Wolf. I'm absolutely delighted that I've got Super Circuit on board to work on Me the Singularity as well. And I'm doing my best and learning all the time with the stuff that I've been doing myself on Lady Beast, on Golden Eggs, and on Field Trip. And it is something I'm getting better at. I mentioned earlier that the UK Tabletop Industry Network had a talk in January from Matt Sanders about crowdfunding. We also had a talk this month, just in February, just a couple of weeks ago, from Virginia Garcia McShannock, who is an incredible graphic designer and layout artist, and does many other things in the tabletop role-playing space that you might know from some Orbital Blues products, or a lot of products from Modiphius, including the Fallout and Star Trek lines, I think. She gave an amazing talk on just introducing the basics of that, which I find incredibly useful and will be definitely taking into any future projects I do when I'm going to be doing that visual side of things myself, and which I would heartily encourage people to download and listen to and sign up to the UK Tin Discord to do so. But it isn't my skill set, it isn't my natural place, and it is definitely something that I have to make a conscious effort to learn more about over time to make sure it's being integrated into what I'm creating.
It's really interesting to know for different people where their sort of conscious effort is around different things, so thank you for sharing that. Does actually bring me on to a next question. You've been the organiser for UK Tin, the Tabletop Industry Network, for the past, is it year and a half or year and...
Yes, just a little over a year now, yeah.
Okay, yes. I guess what I was wondering is, have you noticed any change to your process or work that you think may have been influenced by that role? Either just in terms of maybe wider exposure to other creatives it's been facilitating?
100%. I've already mentioned the stuff that was learned in the Tin Talks we've been doing recently with Matt and with Virginia, but the joy of being able to attend our monthly socials in London with the creative folks that we have in the Tin community, to learn from them and what they're working on, to see how they approach the work that they're doing, and their perspective on what I'm doing and my stance and design philosophy. It's hugely inspiring and it's very useful. it's always really good to be surrounded by people of that kind of level of talent and expertise and experience. I heartily encourage anyone else to get involved with TID if they're not already, not just because I'm the organiser and I have to say that, but because I really feel as though anyone can benefit from the knowledge that is at that organisation's disposal. And, you know, when I started off, we had monthly socials in London. I'm now delighted to say that we're doing monthly socials in Manchester as well, and it is getting more popular all the time. We're looking at expanding into new places, maybe around Nottingham, maybe around Leeds, maybe on the south coast, wherever we can find that there is enthusiasm for tabletop creators in the UK to collaborate and share knowledge and network with each other.
Yeah, it's really worthwhile. So I believe I've gone through all of the pre-written questions I have. What I was thinking of the wrap-up is I'd ask you to do sort of all of the relevant plugs for Me the Singularity, but before I go to that, is there anything that you wanted to talk about that maybe the conversation didn't flow towards that you'd like me to bring in as a question?
No, I know I gave the stuff up top that I thought might come up and it didn't, and that's fine.
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think
cool.
basically covered everything.
So, yeah. Before we wrap up, I just want to thank you again for coming on the podcast for this special episode between seasons. Can you just remind the audience where they can find and support Me the Singularity and for how much longer the campaign will be running for?
For sure. So it's on the Me the Singularity campaign is running on Kickstarter. So if you search for Me the Singularity Kickstarter, you'll certainly find it in your search engine of choice. Bing it. And that's going to be running for the rest of February. So if you're listening to this on or before February 29th. You still have time. February's extra long this year. So please do back that, help us reach some of the stretch goals that we want to get to, and let us know, what it is that you think of the game and what you're excited to try out, and be part of the process of turning that into a finished game.
Where, once the game is released fully, will it be available for people if someone is, say, I don't know, doing a listen back to the podcast in a year from now or something?
For sure. So I'm sure that the PDF version of it will be available on my itch.io. Where the physical version will be, I'm not sure. I'm hoping that we'll have a successful crowdfunding campaign that allow me to get physical versions into your friendly local gaming store, or create some kind of web store where you can purchase it that way. But if you want to be sure about getting a physical copy, really is best to get that right now to back the campaign. Unless you are listening back to it a year later, in which case, I'm sorry. Reach out. We'll try and get you your copy.
Check via the itch, and that will probably have whatever the details are, come what may.
Of course. I'm on itch at Seal of Sabad, so you'll be able to find it there.
Great. Are there any other links you'd want to just mention in the episode? I can include other stuff in the link description.
The only other thing that would be great to promote is the UK Tabletop Industry Network, which we've mentioned a few times that I'm the organiser of. If you search for UK Tabletop Industry Network, you will surely find a link to our Substack mailing list, or our Twitter, or something else, all of which link back to all of our socials. Our Discord community is particularly active, so I'd recommend giving that a try if you want to listen to any of the tin talks that we've done recently, or know about when the next one's going to be.
Great. So once again, thank you, Michael, for coming on, and to the audience, thank you for listening to this episode of This Is Your Life Path. I will see you soon. Actually, stay for after. There'll be a little of the music, and then I'll have an announcement about the second series. But until then, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
So, This Is Your Life Path will be returning with a full second series later this year. I'm looking to record the whole thing ahead of time so we can have an uninterrupted weekly schedule, just because near the end of the first season the schedule sort of disappeared a little bit. I'm in the process of reaching out to guests, but I've also opened up a Google form, so if you are a TTRPG creator listening who'd like to come on the show, the link to that form is in the episode description, or you can find a shorthand at bit.ly/lifepathguest. During the second season, I'll set up a Ko-Fi to try and build a budget for future seasons of the show. I'll announce more details when I have them, and if you're subscribed to this feed, the moment we kick off episodes, they'll be showing up, obviously. But if you want to keep up to date about any other sort of specific goings-on and minutiae, the best way to do that is via my mailing list at ratwavegamehouse.substack.com, which is also in the episode description. I will see you in the future.